Hello, and welcome to the Castle Talk podcast, where we talk to writers and creators of today's genre worlds. From Denver, Colorado, I'm your host, Jason Henderson, author of the Alex Van Helsing series from HarperCollins. Tonight, Gregg Hurwitz is the New York Times best-selling author of 15 thrillers, most recently Orphan X and The Rains, a novel, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. He's also a New York Times best-selling comic book writer. He's written for Marvel with Wolverine and Punisher, as well as DC, featuring the Batman and the Penguin. Additionally, he's written screenplays, sold spec scripts, and he lives in LA, which is a good place if you're going to be doing that kind of thing. Gregg, welcome.
Thank you for having me on.
Oh, I'm so excited to talk about this. The Rains is actually going to be a very, very cool topic, and it actually just came out. All right, so here's what I have on The Rains, and I'm going to read this paragraph, and then I'll just pitch it to you. So, okay, the first young adult page turner from Gregg Hurwitz: in one terrifying night, the peaceful community of Creek's Claws turns into a war zone because no one under the age of 18 is safe. Chance Rain and his older brother Patrick have already fended off multiple attacks from infected adults by the time they arrive at the school where other young survivors are hiding. And that kicks off a survivalist horror novel that is being pitched as YA, and it's called, once again, The Rains. So what I'm hearing, Gregg, when I read about this, I'm hearing basically a Red Dawn zombie story, essentially. So this is your first YA book. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to this book?
Well, most of my books are thrillers for adults. That's what I focused on. But as you mentioned in the introduction, I loved writing comic books. I got to write Batman and Wolverine and a lot of my favorite characters. And when I was doing so, I thought about the appeal of reaching kind of a broader and younger audience, because that's what I was able to do with comics. And I had this idea in the back of my head for a long time to do a book, a young adult book, that sort of didn't take its foot off the accelerator for a minute. I wanted to be really paced. I wanted to not talk down to, younger readers, so that people who are older readers, like I read a lot of YA myself, and so that it could kind of hit everyone across the boards. But I wanted it to be a real kind of white knuckle thriller, and to keep that sort of pacing and that sort of suspense that I've played with and played around a lot with the adult thrillers and with Batman. And so that's what I was seeking to do. And I had this idea for a story. I don't know. Have you ever heard of zombie ants? It's a real thing.
Zombie ants. No. What is that?
So there's a spore that floats around, and it lands on an ant. And it kind of hijacks their brain and burrows in. And the ants, when they're sort of taken over by this spore that's a parasite, they go and find the tallest blade of grass or tree. And they climb to the top of it, and they clamp their mandibles down, and they invert their bodies upside down, and their thoraxes swell and then explode and create more spores, which then go attack more ants.
Good Lord.
And I kept thinking, I remember when I heard about this, for some reason I have a perverse interest in parasites. I just find it fascinating when things take over other organisms and they can't control themselves. And I thought if someone or something was planning a takeover, wouldn't that be the best way to go? It would be so not work-intensive in order to affect people. So in the small town of Creek's Cause, which is where The Rains takes place, that's precisely what happens, is a meteor breaks up, it showers the small town, these stalks rise and explode like corn stalks almost, and some of the adults go and seek out the roofs of houses or the tops of water towers, and their abdomens swell and then explode and infect other people. And the only ones not affected are, kids under the age of 18.
So first of all, okay, before we get to the fact that it's affecting kids, this thing that you've just described with the swelling and the exploding, immediately a couple of things popped into my head, and one of them, of course, is the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the Philip Kaufman movie from 1978. Did you ever see that?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember it came in the rain? I love this. It's such a wonderful sort of, I don't know if you intended as an homage, but it certainly, it makes me remember that those guys, it came in droplets of rain in the beginning.
Yeah. It's so funny because so many things I love genre, right? I grew up reading horror and watching it and thrillers and suspense and mysteries, and it's sort of like that's how my whole brain works, So this book wasn't a specific homage to one thing like that, but it's all kind of in there. It's like your brain's a blender, and
Yeah,
everything that you feed it is what you're reading and watching. And a lot of us who love pop culture, there's a lot of touchstones and reference points. Like you mentioned Red Dawn,
yeah,
that's another one I didn't even think of, but the original was during my formative years. I mean, that movie
sure.
was huge to me. Um,
Yeah. Well, I mean,
so
you probably can't get away from I think you said it yourself. That stuff works through your brain and it comes back out. And there's no I please understand that when I point something out as like a trope or whatever, that's not at all to suggest that these aren't the way stories should be written, because obviously they are. Like if Oedipus Rex that we have is certainly isn't the first version of that story.
no,
And
of course.
and yeah. But very, very cool. Well, I like what you said about, the idea of a thriller that doesn't slow down. Do you have any heroes in that regard? Like if you can think of like a book that you've read that sort of goes off, nonstop through the book, can you think of any examples?
Well, for me, the perfect thriller ever written is Thomas Harris's Red Dragon. I just
Oh
think it's
yeah,
a flawless book. I mean, I read him breathlessly. He wrote Silence of the Lambs also, of
sure.
course. Black Sunday. He's amazing with it. In terms of speed and propulsiveness, Lee Child is also wonderful. I love the
Oh yeah.
Jack Reacher series. Um,
He
I,
paces those really well. It's
yeah,
kind of funny, or I say he paces them really well, but the fact is when you're actually reading them, he often takes a hell of a lot of time just on like communing with Reacher's thoughts. Or I remember in one Lee Child, and you're right, they move like a bullet, or at least you feel them that way. And yet I remember in one, he literally takes a page and a half to describe the sun rising, and I'm
yep,
like,
yep. You
and
know who
like,
else
do,
is wonderful are the Spencer books. The Robert B. Parker stuff is
oh yeah,
really paced nicely. I mean, you're never feeling like you're mired in a couple chapters. And I thought especially with a young adult book, I just wanted it to move. I mean, so
yeah,
it's all the character development and all the stuff that really matters. At the end of the day, if you don't have characters that you care about,
yeah.
all you're doing is getting kind of hit in the face with plot, and so that's never interesting at all. But the challenge that I set for myself was for every chapter to just be driving forward and to lay all the character development in alongside the action and suspense, so that all of the character work is coming out of these moments that you're just turning those pages as fast as you can. That's my hope for it.
Talk to me about Chance and Patrick, your main characters, and also when you're setting out to write a story like this, you kind of have an idea for what the story is, but how do you come up with a set of characters that you think will resonate?
It's so weird. For me, the plot occurs to me kind of wrapped around the characters. It's not that it's one and then the other. I mean, I
Mhm.
think that the thing that's unusual here is I have two brothers. Chance is 15 and Patrick is 17. So, of
Yeah,
course, if everybody is going to change into something that's awful when they're 18, there's a built-in ticking clock, in that Patrick, the older brother, his 18th birthday is 2 weeks away when we open our story. And I wanted these brothers they're very, very different. Patrick is kind of really tough. He's a lot like a cowboy. He's tall, he's broad, he's just sort of fully grown. And Chance is a little bit more in his head. He's more academic. There's a real contrast between them. What I didn't want to do is have it play like the sort of typical rivalries that we often see and we're always tired of. So these brothers are really different, and they really contrast each other, but they love each other and they have each other's backs no matter what. And
yeah,
adding to this slight complication is Patrick's girlfriend, Alex, from Alexandra. And Alex is 17. She's right between them in age. I'm sorry, she's 16.
yeah,
And so she's right between them in age. And, her and Patrick have a great relationship, but the three of them grew up together. So all three of them are also like best friends. And Chance
sure.
sort of has a bit of an unrequited crush
Yeah,
on Alex, who's his older brother's girlfriend. But it's rather than having it be this sort of intense or driven love triangle, what it is this really loyal relationship between all three of them, that these three kids grew up together. They always look out for each other. They'll always do what's in the best interest of the other ones. And I thought that would be such an interesting position to explore this from.
so Chance has to basically help solve this problem before he loses his own older brother to this
Exactly.
plague. Yeah. And so the book plays out over over the course of just a few days, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a couple weeks.
Yeah, beautiful. The whole thing is in first person, isn't it? I mean, you don't change. Do you? I know from the beginning it's in first person from Chance's perspective. Do you ever switch perspective, or do you stay in the entire first
Nope, it's
person the whole
all
way?
Chance's perspective. There's some stuff that gets reported, but he's kind
Yeah,
of compiled it. It's told in a series of journal entries that he's
yeah,
writing down. And so now and then he'll compile information from other people to let us know what might be happening in the world at large. But everything is through the prism of Chance. He's really the voice of the book.
Do you find there is any challenge in having like say let's take something like I don't know, like The Stand or something, like some Stephen King thingamabob, where every chapter you have a different POV, and so you can kind of bop around from chapter to chapter. And if you get bored with one, you can like move across the state to a different character. You don't have that opportunity here. You're stuck between the shoulders of Chance. So how do you keep the information coming and keep from getting overwhelmed yourself?
Well, you know what's interesting? So I've written books from both. I've written, gosh, 5 or 6 books that are first person, and
Yeah.
most of my books are in third person.
Hmm.
And third person certainly gives you more leeway and flexibility to get in the heads of other characters. But it's interesting because the limitation of first person can sometimes provide opportunities. And so all of a sudden,
Uh-huh.
if you're telling the whole story from one perspective, certain information comes in much more suspensefully or more like scares are even more scary because we don't know what else is happening because you're only watching it through one camera lens. And it also kind of weds you to that character a lot more. So I really hope that people feel very close with Chance because we're living inside his head for, 350 pages.
Yeah.
So there's some opportunities also as much as it's limiting, and in the ways that you're constrained to tell the story, sometimes you can tell more interesting aspects of the story. You get a more interesting perspective in on it.
Hmm. That's yeah, I can totally see because of course you can go way deeper. Every possible thing that happens, you have an opportunity to share a little bit more about what the character actually thought about that thing. And I guess the big danger, of course, is don't get too hung up on that, or else you'll wind up you'll wind up with a very long long book if everything gets commentary.
Right.
Um, Wow, I love that it takes place in a small town. So, what's your background? Are you from a small town like this,
So I'm
or
from Northern California, but what I wanted in the story, it's a bit of a throwback to like the Robert Louis Stevenson and Jack London
Sure.
books that I grew up with. I wanted a real kind of adventuring type of story. And so
Yeah.
I say in a square state nestled among others. I never named the state,
Hey, I
but it's
live in one
in
of those, actually.
which one do you live in?
I live in Colorado.
All right, there you go.
Yeah.
And
Anyway, go ahead.
yeah, and so basically I wanted it set where these kids, a lot of the kids in the story, since they're the ones who are going to be driving things, have a lot of practical skills. They're farmers, they're ranchers, they're tough, they can do stuff, they're used to working in fields. So in that way it's got a very old-fashioned kind of muscular energy to it.
Hmm.
And that was one of the things that I was looking for rather than have it take place in, say, San Francisco or in an urban setting.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. And it's funny because especially with kids, dealing with teenagers, so you have these very recognizable set pieces that come from a small town, such as the schools and the streets and everything that look different from. Imagine if these kids were in a public school in like downtown San Francisco or something like that. It'd be
Yeah,
it'd be very
absolutely.
different.
And I didn't want the answer to just be that they Google stuff. I wanted to keep it
Right.
where they're contemporary kids, they speak in contemporary way. Their language, they're smart Alex. It's got that whole aspect to it.
Yeah.
But I wanted it to be that it's not, technologically dependent, and so they're out. A lot of this is rural. And one of the shows that was a touchstone for me, I mean, not in a specific way, but as a general aesthetic, is The Walking Dead.
Sure.
Which I think
Sure.
does that really well.
Well, and in a sense, you're hearkening to zombie. This is I think uh, I can't. Jonathan Maberry called this a reimagining of the zombie novel. In a sense, it's a reimagining of several kinds of novels in one way, but there is a zombie thing going on here, and I can
Yeah, it's sort of
totally
like a
see your point about Walking Dead. Yeah.
yeah, it's a bit of it's like if Michael Crichton tackled the zombie novel. Like there's a sort
Yeah.
of
Yeah,
science-y edge to it also, rather than
that's a
just
really great way to put it. Yeah, I mean, I can absolutely see that. The other one I can think of is The Crazies,
yeah, yeah.
which was the God,
That was
who
a
was
good
that?
little movie, boy.
Romero, right? I think
Yeah, and then
where
it was
where
remade. Yeah.
yeah, where suddenly something is affecting people and turning them into homicidal maniacs. That is really scary. I mean, do you think, when you think about it, the idea of the adults around you. So I'm talking about your readers, okay? I'm talking about your young readers. The adults around you, who in theory are the people that you trust to have your back no matter what, just like you said with the brothers. They're the ones who, in theory, are going to pay the mortgage on the house, or pay the rent and are going to put food on the table. The idea that they might be the ones who turn into monsters overnight and are going to hurt you or kill you, that seems like an extremely disturbing scenario to play out. Why do you think it's such a popular scenario? I mean, why does it resonate so much with
Well, I
with
think
uh, the reader?
in this case, it is uniquely horrific to see people who you care about transformed. And that
Yeah,
might be a metaphor for sickness or aging or death, and since that's sort of the
yeah,
ultimate unknown that's confronting us. In this instance, I also think that part of it is that when you turn 18, which of course is legal adult age,
yeah.
you turn into one of them in my
Turn into
book.
one of them. Yeah,
And so that's one of the things of like, a kid's fear of like, what's your worst fear is that your parents and adults want to turn you into someone just like them. It's part of being
yeah.
socialized, or socialized.
Well, and likewise, that's the nature of monsters, isn't it? I mean, somebody like a vampire story. A vampire comes to your family, a vampire attacks your sister becomes a different horrible person who's leeching off of you. That's also what happens when somebody becomes an addict, right? Or when
Huh?
somebody
Yeah, and
becomes
vampires play off, seduction. It's the seduction of somebody away from their senses. And I
yeah,
think in some ways with my story, a lot of the interest that I was playing with is that, as these kids, they're sort of free and independent and have the spirit and bearing and personalities of kids. And there's that fear when you get older is like, am I going to be like everyone else? Am I going to have a cubicle? Or in this book, am I going to work on the farm like my parents?
yeah,
And do we just become what our parents are? And I think that's always a fear. And the fear is that, when you're younger and you see adults, and as you become an adult, one of the challenges is how you keep alive, how you keep a liveliness, once everything's not new. Once you're through high school and you're through college, how do you keep a sense of wonder in the world, which is something that comes quite naturally to kids.
yeah.
So looking forward, I think that's something that these kids are dreading, and so to literalize that in the book and to play with those themes was really fun, and to make it,
Absolutely.
horrific and scary.
Is there anything, Greg, that you wrote differently because this was a YA book that you would have done differently if you were writing it as an adult book?
I think, look, I'm of a mind that you never talk down to kids.
Yeah,
I'm always amazed. I love kids. I'm a dad, and when I'm always amazed at people who don't have kids, how much they talk to kids as if they're just kids. And if
yeah,
you're a parent, if you're comfortable with kids, you realize how smart they are and how engaged they are, and you can poke fun at them. And like, there's a real way to have a conversation with kids of all ages where you're not speaking to them as if they represent their age category, but you just talk to them like people. And
yeah,
so in that spirit, when I wrote this book, I did not, dumb it down or take an edge off the humor or write in simpler sentences. I didn't do any of that. I would say, there is less swearing in it. I didn't, there's not stacks in it. Like, there's certain things that are in my thrillers that are geared towards adults. But
yeah,
aside from that, it's pretty scary. It's pretty thrilling, I hope. There's a good amount of gore. I hope it's funny. I hope it
yeah.
has there's a flirtatious energy to it. It's playing around with real life or death stuff. People forget how dark kids are and how dark kids' sensibility. You know?
Yeah. I mean, in other words, there's no difference. There's no difference other than in theory language because you have to
Right.
be concerned about school librarians being
Yeah.
offended and wanting to pull the
Well, and
book.
also, my protagonist is 15. There's a lot of kids in middle school. And,
Sure.
high school reading this, I didn't want to be dropping F-bombs left and right. It just seemed like
Sure.
bad form.
Well, it's kind of funny, this is what I often think about like HBO programming is like I get that we're cable and so you're allowed to have like naked people all the time. But the fact is sometimes you get the impression that we're just doing it because this is HBO.
And have naked
And
people all the time. Yes.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I have no problem with gratuitous language or nudity or anything. I couldn't care less. But sometimes you do get the impression it's like, wow, I have a feeling that this person would have like roughly 90% less F-bombs if this wasn't an HBO if this were
Well,
like
and
real
yeah,
life.
and used sparingly, is
Right?
so much more effective. I
Yeah.
mean, that's the main thing for me is about the effectiveness of storytelling. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your process. So when you're working on a book, like The Reigns or like whatever you have coming up next, do you uh, first of all, how much do you try to? Are you one of those people who tries to accomplish a certain amount a week? And if so, how much? And how does that
well, it
work?
depends. I mean, I do a lot of, I do TV and movies, and so a lot now. I don't have a regular set schedule
Hmm.
because, if I'm off on set, if I have a lot of meetings, if I'm doing a screenplay, that's different than a book. But, I do have kind of a set of parameters in my head of what I want to get done for the day. And so that's how I tend to tackle it. If I'm working on a book, it's usually I know what a good day looks like and I know when I'm focused.
Yeah.
But sometimes I'm spend a day editing and I might take out a TV pitch. So obviously that day is not going to be the same. I just got back from book tour in Holland and Belgium, and those days aren't going to look like my writing days here. And so I've had to sort of expand my definition of what a acceptable work day is because it can't all be typing.
No, of course. I mean, and working on a pitch, that's something that's densely packed in just a few pages, but it needs to be right, and it's different from writing a chapter.
Yeah.
That's so. Where do you, assuming you're not in some hotel in Holland, when you're at home, do you write? Do you go to Starbucks? What do you do?
Oh no, I just write. I have a home office with a soundproof door, and I have two giant Rhodesian Ridgeback dogs, and you'll see
Uh,
Ridgebacks are featured very prominently in the Reigns. So I
yeah.
have 250 pounds of dog with me in my office, who I'm looking at right now. Hi, boys.
Ah,
And I just write all day. I usually go get in a workout or I hike the boys midday,
hmm.
and then I come back and write some more, and then I drink some bourbon.
Fabulous. Fabulous. Well, that's really, really cool. All right. So the book is The Reigns. It just came out a couple of weeks ago. It is very scary. It is a young adult novel, but as Mr. Hurwitz was saying, it's just written like a thriller. So The Reigns, a novel, comes out from this is Tor, I believe,
Yep.
and you can get it pretty much anywhere. Where can people look for your own website, by the way? What's your URL?
I'm GreggHurwitz.net.
All right. Outstanding. That's Greg with two G's. So very good.
Yep. GREGG.
GreggHurwitz.net. The book is The Reigns. Thank you so much for being on, and I hope we get a chance to talk again soon.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Bye.
And happy holidays. Bye.
You too.